Hello, 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 Crime Squad podcast listeners. Welcome back to Crime Squad podcast with your host, Natasha. I'm glad you're here. Today's episode is about a cold case that sat unsolved for over 30 years, leaving not just a family, but a community wondering what happened to one of their own. Let's go back to March of 1986 in Tacoma, Washington. The year 1986 started with an insurmountable tragedy. The Challenger space shuttle exploded during launch, killing all 7 crew members. Onlookers at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida watched in horror as this event unfolded. Ronald Reagan was president. The Statue of Liberty had reopened after 2 years of renovations, and, in my opinion, it was a pretty stellar year for movies. Top Gun was released in 1986, as well as Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Labyrinth, Stand By Me, Platoon, and so many more. In March of 1986, one of the number one songs according to the Billboard Top 100 was the song Sarah by Starship. And for school children, as well as university or college students, spring break started in late March, providing a week off school. 1986 marked a hell of a year for spring break in Palm Springs. Students actually caused massive riots that were documented as a significant historical event, because nothing like that had ever happened before. But far away from Palm Springs and Tacoma, Washington, things were going at a slower and quieter pace. Michella Welch and her sisters, Angela and Nicole, had a babysitter for the week because their mother had to work. Michella was the oldest of her siblings and was a 6th grader and 12 years old. Angela was 11 and Nicole was 9. Michella was a remarkable child, having a real aptitude for music. She loved to play the piano and the violin. And if you couldn't find her, she'd probably be off somewhere with her nose in a book because she loved to read. She got to know the school librarian quite well, and the librarian recalls Michella as someone who would read anything and everything she could get her hands on. It sounds a lot like me as a kid. Michella was a creative person and also had artistic ability. She could draw things with great detail, from animals to people and many other things in between. She also loved to write poems and stories. Michella also volunteered to help with the breakfast program at Grant Elementary School. The program was for children whose parents could not afford regular meals for their children. Michella would wake up and get ready for school early so she could show up and help serve the food before the school day began. She was such a kind-hearted person, and she loved her family and was always looking out for her little sisters. The photograph I found online by searching Michella's name shows a little girl with straight blonde locks falling past her shoulders. One side is pinned back. She has big eyes behind thick-framed round glasses, and her glasses rest atop an aquiline nose. Her smile displays a happy and toothy grin. On Wednesday, March 26, 1986, Michella and her sisters decided to go out and spend the day playing at Puget Park. They hopped on their bikes, some reports say roller skates too, and rode the 2 miles to the park for a day of fun together. Something would go horribly wrong that day, and it would tear a hole through the hearts of the Welch family, as well as the community. At around 11 a.m., sisters Michella, Christine, and Nicole arrived at Puget Park and were looking to spend the day playing and having fun. When the girls got hungry for lunch, Michella said she would ride back home and get sandwiches for them, and she would bring them back. She hopped on her bike and made the roughly 15-minute trip back home. While Michella was gone, at around 12:30, her sisters went to a local business because they had to use the bathroom. They returned to the park around 1 and continued playing, but they did note that it was odd their sister wasn't back yet. At around 2, the girls noticed Michella's bike was back at the park, and it was padlocked, so obviously she'd arrived at the park at some point. On a nearby table were some sandwiches, along with some Easter candy, so clearly Michella had brought them lunch, but she was nowhere to be found. The girls knew enough to know something wasn't right, so they contacted their babysitter, who then contacted the girls' mother, Barbara. A search began almost immediately, involving police and a group of 40 to 60 search and rescue personnel from Pierce and Thurston counties. There were also 8 tracking dogs involved because the search for the lost little girl was a desperate one. Where was Michella? 9 hours after the search for Michella began, one of the 8 tracking dogs used in the search located Michella Welch. She was found in the park about 60 yards off the Gulch Trail. Unfortunately, Michella was deceased. Initial observations provided to the press by search and rescue crews said her hands were clenched tightly and were covered in mud. It looked like she had put up a struggle. Searchers also said Michella's throat appeared to have been slit and her clothes were in disarray, but police did not provide official commentary to these points. Barbara Welch, Michella's mother, was devastated by the news and was reportedly taken to the hospital to be treated for shock. Michella had been found, but the work was just beginning. There were so many questions to be answered. Who, what, where, why, and when were the main ones. Police theorized Michella, upon not immediately seeing her sisters when she got back to the park with their lunch, thought maybe they had gone into the gulch. Now, I had to look this up because I didn't know what that was. So a gulch, for those of you who don't know, is a narrow and steep-sided ravine, which marks the course of a fast-moving stream. So it can obviously be a pretty dangerous place. Witnesses recalled seeing Michella talking to a man who was pointing towards the Gulch Trail, which actually led police to believe that Michella may have been taken advantage of by a man who said he could help her find her sisters. As far as suspects, though, there were none. Michella's funeral took place on March 31st with over 200 attendees, many of them students from Michella's school. Her eulogy was delivered by her aunt, Cynthia, who recalled Michella living in her stories and drawings, and to provide some comfort, said Michella will always live on in the dreams of magic and light. Excerpts of one of Michella's poems were read at the service, which I'll share with you here. Deep, deep down in the beautiful forest, in the early greening of spring, there is the most beautiful thing you ever saw on earth. It is a golden pond. At the golden pond, the little prince child comes to watch and to forget what he has done wrong. So if you are true in your heart and can love at sunset, you are the one to see this shimmering golden pond. Michella was laid to rest. However, there were still no leads on the investigation. Police continued their investigation and announced to the public that Michella had, in fact, been sexually assaulted, and her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. They had collected unknown male DNA at the scene and had followed up on a number of tips from the public regarding men seen in the area at the time. On August 4th, just 5 months after Michella's horrific murder, a preteen girl named Jennifer Bastian would go missing after she'd left home to ride her bike. Tragically, she was sexually assaulted and killed that very same day, but it would take several weeks for police to locate her body. Finally, at the end of August, Jennifer was located in a wooded area, but it was later determined she had been dead since August 4th. From the outset, police were unsure if the cases were linked. 2 young girls sexually assaulted and killed in the span of 5 months? Seemed likely these horrible acts were committed by the same depraved individual. I'm sure in 1986 it was easier to believe it was one person because surely the idea of multiple people capable of doing this was terrifying as it was. And if you can imagine for a moment how frightening this would be to parents and children in this quiet community. people were afraid. What seemed like a carefree and fun thing to do, like going for a bike ride, was now marked by fear and distrust. 2 children stolen in the same year in a city where violent crime was definitely not the norm. Was there a serial predator preying on children in Tacoma? With no leads, the answer to that question remained unknown. Barbara Leonard was completely torn apart by the untimely death of her daughter, Michella. 6 months after Michella was murdered, Barbara was quoted in the local newspaper as saying, quote, "It's getting close to 6 months since Michella died, and yet it seems like it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. Time becomes insignificant when you're dealing with grief. It's like somebody can think about it and think how bad it is to lose a child, but it's worse than you ever think it could be. Losing a relationship, a pet, or even having a house burned to the ground, nothing compares to the loss, grief, heartache, the depression of losing a child," end quote. 6 months became a year. A year became 2. 2 became 4, and so on. A reward was offered leading to information regarding Michella's murder. Nobody came forward with tips that led to anything substantial. In 2006, police revisited the DNA sample obtained in 1986 from the crime scene, but there was no match in the database. Children in the city in 1986 grew into adults as the years passed by. Many would go on to have families of their own. Those who remember the spring and summer of 1986 when 2 little girls were violently removed from the world will never forget. Lindsay Wade remembers. She grew up in the area and was just 11 years old in 1986. She grew up and became a police detective in Tacoma, and during her career, she visited both the Jennifer Bastian and Michella Welch cases. Detective Wade was convinced there was one man responsible for both girls' deaths. As she pored through the case files, she saw that although DNA had been collected from semen present at Michella's crime scene, no DNA had been located in Jennifer's case. So Detective Wade decided to try and obtain a sample from Jennifer's swimsuit, which she had been wearing at the time of her murder. Amazingly, there was a semen sample located in the crotch area of the swimsuit, and this was a huge breakthrough. The samples were sent for testing, and shockingly, testing determined the semen was not a DNA match. The samples came from 2 different DNA sources, meaning there wasn't just one killer, but 2. Despite advances in DNA testing, when the samples were run through the database, police were no closer to solving either of these cases. There was simply no match detected within any of the DNA databases used by police. In 2016, Detective Wade had the DNA samples sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a lab dedicated to creating DNA profiles and using genetic genealogy and phenotyping to narrow down potential suspects. Okay, so side note, if you've been following advancements in forensic technology, you may already know how this science works. But if you're not sure, here's the gist of it. And this is right from Parabon Nanolabs' How It Works section of their website. Genetic genealogy uses autosomal DNA, which is also known as ATDNA, which is single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, to determine how closely related 2 individuals are. Unlike other genetic markers, such as mitochondrial DNA or Y chromosome DNA, ATDNA is inherited from all ancestral lines and passed on by both males and females, and thus can be used to compare any 2 individuals, regardless of how they're related. However, ATDNA SNPs are more difficult to obtain from forensic samples, which is why Parabon has created an optimized laboratory protocol to ensure high-quality results even from small degraded DNA samples. So this is pretty exciting, and this technology is emerging all the time. In 2016, the testing Detective Wade had conducted was DNA phenotyping. So this type of testing allows science to create a genetic snapshot of a person's physical traits and genetic makeup. After this testing was conducted, the data was uploaded to genealogy websites, which allowed genetic genealogists the ability to drill down information, so much so that a list of potential names and of the suspects in these crimes could be generated, helping to narrow the search locally. It was 2018 when Detective Wade retired from the force, but she had worked tirelessly to try and solve these cold cases, even reviewing over 2,300 suspects with a fine-tooth comb, and she never gave up on the DNA testing. Within 1 month of her retirement, she got a phone call. It was an update, and it was regarding the case of Jennifer Bastian. Spoiler alert, it was solved. I won't get into the details because this is Michella Welch's case, but I did include Jennifer's so you can understand the journey it took to get justice for these brutal slayings. A few months after Jennifer's case was finally solved, Parabon Nanolabs was able to create a genetic profile with the DNA from Michella's case. Genetic genealogists believe the DNA belonged to one of two people, and they were brothers. Armed with this information, investigators began surveillance on one of the men on June 4th, 2018. The man had no idea, of course, that he was being watched. This operation would blow the case wide open on June 5th, so just 1 day after he started being monitored by police. So on June 5th, police observed the man in question leaving his home to go to work for the day, where he worked at a local psychiatric hospital. He was a nurse there. During the man's workday, he left to go to a restaurant with a coworker, and he used a napkin during lunch, which is totally normal. We all do that. But he threw that napkin out. And so that's fair game. The investigators collected the napkin, sent it for testing, and just like that, it would come back as a match. By June 20th, Gary Hartman, age 66 at the time, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and first-degree rape. In 1986, Hartman wasn't even on police's radar as a suspect. He was in his 30s at that time. Databases reveal Gary Hartman led a crime-free life, or at the very least had managed to evade law enforcement catching him doing anything illegal, which is why his DNA was not in the database initially when these searches had been conducted. During his first court appearance in June of 2018, Hartman pleaded not guilty to the charges levied against him. Hartman was not in court again until 2022, probably because of the pandemic, when the world stopped. And during court, he had this to say.
His family.
I'm so sorry. God knows I'm so sorry. And that doesn't help. I'm just sorry.
It was March 22nd, 2022. Almost 36 years to the day Michella Welch was raped and killed, that Gary Hartman stood in front of a judge at the bench trial he requested. It took less than 2 hours for Judge Stanley Rumbaugh to find Hartman guilty and sentence the now 70-year-old man to 26 years and 6 months in prison. Throughout the court proceedings, Hartman expressed emotion by sobbing continually. His sobs grew louder when Michella's family talked about the never-ending grief they experienced at the loss of their beautiful, loving Michella at the hands of a monster who hid for over 30 years. All Hartman could muster were the words, quote, "I am so sorry. God knows I'm so sorry, and that doesn't help. I'm just sorry," end quote. Well, folks, that is going to do it for this bonus content episode of Crime Squad Podcast. In this particular case, Pierce County Prosecutor Mark Lindquist said it best when he said, quote, "DNA technology is rapidly advancing. If you're a criminal who left DNA at a crime scene, you might as well turn yourself in now. We will eventually catch you," end quote. I wonder how many people who haven't committed crimes and haven't been caught are a little jumpy right now as forensic science progresses. Thank you so much for listening, and feel free to get in touch. Reach out to me via email at crimesquadpodcast@gmail.com or visit any of my socials. I'm on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. To be honest, I don't use Facebook as much, but I don't really get a lot of engagement there anyway. Anyway, if you like the way I cover cases, be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. We call that joining the squad, so be part of our squad, join us. Until next time, I will leave you with the words of Dr. Edmund Locard, a pioneer of forensic science. Every contact leaves a trace. Stay safe, folks.